but after multiple viewings, it just starts to come clearer and clearer and clearer. And everybody always asks me about, what was it like? What was the emotion like? Especially on dives. You dived on Titanic. What did it feel like to see her come in? See, when I'm working this stuff, to me, I'm in data acquisition mode. I'm not very emotional at all.
Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries and everything else to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Join us and our special guests as we continue the 25th anniversary celebrations of Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
I'm Nelson Aspen, and you're back with Titanic Talk. And in all of our dozens of episodes that we've recorded so far, I don't think we've ever had a guest that can accommodate all aspects of Titanic the way that tonight's guest can. Whether you're a fan of a film adaptation, a book, the historical event, the scientific aspect, the maritime aspect, whatever it is about Titanic that interests you, our guest tonight knows a lot about it. Our very special guest, my co-host Alexandra Boyd, is going to do the introductions. Alexandra.
Well, I'm so excited to introduce to you Parks Stephenson, who I know many people who follow the story, follow current stories of Titanic and obviously history and everything in between of Titanic will be very familiar with his name and his work. Parks, thank you so much for coming along to talk with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm not sure I'm an all about town Titanic guy, but there are certain aspects of the subject that I can discuss.
Don't have to find Leonardo DiCaprio dreamy. You can be here for all the esteemed reasons. We should point out also that you're the executive director of the USS Kidd Veterans Museum in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Is that where you're coming to us from today?
Well, I'm coming to you from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I just got home from the museum, and this is my room. I do have a Kidd flag over there. Let's see, over there. But you'll see some Titanic over there. So anyway, this is my office.
The first thing we ask all of our guests is the initial entryway. What was the moment that led you to Titanic? You had a very distinguished career in the military, but then now you sort of segued into exploration, which led you to James Cameron. I mean, it's a very long, winding path. But tell us the transition. What got you to Titanic specifically initially?
Well, it actually started when I was a kid in the 1960s. I saw the 1953 version of the movie Titanic. And after seeing the ship go under the waves with the men and the boys standing along the rail as she went down and people in the lifeboats, I was hooked. I did follow it in my teenage years, back in the days when you corresponded with, or you found other Titanic enthusiasts and corresponded to them through the Titanic Historical Society via postal mail. So you would have a question and you'd write it in a letter and you'd send it off, and maybe a month or two later, you'd get a reply. I went into the Navy for 20 years, in which I didn't do any research at all. Coming out in the late 90s, they'd invented a thing called the internet. And in those early days, these Titanic discussion groups, and I think the old Titanic enthusiasts will remember the flame wars of the late 90s when Titanic enthusiasts basically attacked each other. You signed on with a handle. You didn't use your real name at first in those early days. And I selected basically my call sign when I was flying in the Navy, which was a takeoff on my name, Parks Stephenson. It was Sparks. And I chose Sparks 401 as my handle. And because of that, people thought that because Sparks is the nickname for the wireless telegraphists at sea, that I must be a Marconi expert, which I wasn't, but I became one. There wasn't much known about the Marconi installation aboard Titanic at that time. And I had to piece together what little information there was and drew it together into a paper, basically, which along the way, I ran into Bill and Eric Sauter, who introduced me to Ken Marshall, who saw my work on the wireless telegraph and said that James Cameron was about to go out in 2001 on an expedition and he might find my information useful. So I presented it to Cameron. And yes, on that expedition, Cameron got into the Marconi room with his bots. And because of what I had in the paper, he recognized what he saw. And from then on, I joined his team.
Amazing.
Were you on that expedition as well? Were you there when they went into the Marconi room? How amazing.
I was supposed to be, but then 9/11 happened here in America, and the Keldysh was stuck off the coast, and nobody could go out, nobody could come in. So they dived a lot on Titanic, and I was supposed to join mid-expedition and did not. So I missed out on the 2001 expedition, but when they returned, a lot of imagery was turned over to me for analysis. And that's when I basically recreated the Marconi room from the wreck imagery, which was the first time we'd ever seen the silent room, the transmitter apparatus of the Marconi system, because there was no previous documentation of it. And each Marconi installation was unique.
What was that like, Parks? What was that like looking at that footage? I mean, I feel like we're very familiar with that footage now because the whole movie opens with the dive and all of the amazing footage that's happened and been retrieved since then. But what was it like being shown that footage for the very first time?
Yeah, pioneers, really, true pioneers.
Well, in the beginning, you don't know what the hell you're looking at. And it takes multiple viewings to start to discern shapes that look familiar and cross-checking with what you do know. And maybe the imagery forces you to look at other sources. If you cannot recognize them, forcing you into areas where you learn what's down there. And it was not an easy process. I will say that when I first got the imagery, I really didn't know what I was looking at. But after multiple viewings, it just starts to come clearer and clearer and clearer. And everybody always asks me about, what was it like? What was the emotion like? Especially on dives. You dived on Titanic. What did it feel like to see her come in? See, when I'm working this stuff, to me, I'm in data acquisition mode. I'm not very emotional at all. I'm looking at.
I don't think you could afford to be, eh? I mean, your military training would have taught you that.
Well, military is more an engineering viewpoint. When I retired from the military, I became an aerospace engineer. Worked for Hughes Aircraft, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, places like that. And to me, it was an engineering problem that needed to be solved. And so, and actually knowledge of how electrical systems work, knowledge of how, once I read all the period literature on how the wireless system worked, then you could start to either see it in the imagery or you knew it was there and it's missing and you go looking for it until you, and in this case, actually find it.
And at the time in 1912, the Marconi room was state of the art, wasn't it? It was everyone knows it's the first time they used the SOS signal, but also we spoke to Craig Kelly, who played Harold Bride, how James Cameron's note
Sparks.
to him. Yes, he was a spark. Yes. He was like, Craig is like, what am I playing here? Who is this? Who is this kid? And Jim said, he's a cyberpunk.
Mhm.
He's the cutting edge. He's the kid that's learned all the new technology that he's passing on to the older guy who's probably more experienced, but knew less about this new technology.
Cameron was exactly right in that. These were the geeks of the day. They were not part of the White Star Line crew. They were employees of the Marconi Telegraph Company, which had different branches. There's one in the UK, there's one in America. In this case, of course, would be the UK. And they were brought on board to provide a paid service to the shipping line, convenience to the passengers. They were aboard primarily to process paid passenger traffic, but they also were required under Postmaster General regulations to process navigational messages, any messages that pertain to the safe navigation of the ship. And this would play a role a little bit later in the story. But yes, they were there primarily as a convenience for the passengers.
And we talk about geeks, and we all of us who are self-professed Titaniacs know that Jim Cameron is the king of Titaniacs, and his enthusiasm and sort of adventuresome nature to make these explorations. You would need clinical professionals such as yourself to be responsible so that he could go down and have this sort of wide-eyed glory. Tell me about the relationship with him and how he came to rely on you and your union together in these many experiences that you shared.
Well, Jim is a very knowledgeable kind of engineer, thought processing guy himself. He came up when he decided to get into film. He came up from the ranks, so to speak, as a special effects person, making the actual practical effects that were used in different movies. And then he got into directing, and he brought with directing a very grounded sense of how things worked. You need only explain one concept to him that he wasn't already aware of for him to get it. And I'd like to say that one of the reasons why he keeps me around is because I keep him challenged. We can discuss practical matters like this in a way, and I'm not afraid to argue with him. Some people are, but he respects a considered opinion. A lot of people in the movie business are not of this mindset. They don't know how to talk on a very practical level. And I'm sure that Jim encounters a lot of that in the industry. And when there's somebody on his team who can go to the mat, so to speak, on certain technical aspects, he actually relishes it. Now, he doesn't always appreciate everything I say. We've had our outs, but each time he forgets it and comes back later for more. He doesn't hold grudges when we have disagreements. There's one area right now where we do have a constant disagreement, and that is the manner in which the collision happened. He has shown in his movie the traditional hitting the iceberg along the side theory, and I have come over the years to believe, based on evidence that I see, that the ship actually grounded on the iceberg and did not hit it along the side. And that is a large, and they're both theories. They're both difficult to prove. And right now it's, let's just say I haven't swayed Jim to my side of the argument yet.
Yeah, I mean, in layman's terms, sticking with that, what causes you to believe that your theory?
Well, it started in the early 2000s. I worked with a guy named David Brown, who's since passed. He wrote a book called Last Log of the Titanic. And when I read that book, I saw that he had similar skepticism as I did. And we got together and we started with the passenger testimony. He was a mariner, I was a mariner. And what we were reading in the passenger testimony describing the nature of the collision didn't sound like a sideways bump. Like, you know, if you're standing in a boat and you're not holding on to anything, you're just standing there and you come alongside a pier and you hit it kind of hard, you're going to get shoved to the side. Nobody really describes that motion. Everybody seems to describe, you know, like rolling over 1,000 marbles. It seemed to be a motion over the same momentum vector as the ship. I think it was Pittman who said that he thought the anchor was being released. All of these to us sounded like more of a grounding event than a sideways hit. And then of course there's a very telling comment from Lookout Lee, Reginald Lee, who said that at the inquiry in London that the starboard side of the ship seemed to lift slightly as they passed the berg. We wrote a paper on this theory back in the 2000s. We presented it to the Marine Forensic Board, who basically laughed us out of the room. They didn't even seriously consider it. But as time would go on, I would, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary, as we got prepared for documentaries in 2012, in 2011, I asked for, from the History Channel, that they fund an experiment where we made replicas of the area where we believe there's only, you've seen in all the movies, you've seen in diagrams in books, you've heard about the Polaris imaging sub-bottom profiler scans that describe a series of holes in the side of Titanic. There's really only one hole breach that's been corroborated, and that is the one that Fireman Barrett saw outside of Boiler Room 6. Everything else is speculative. Even the Polaris image scans are not completely reliable, because what is not often mentioned is that the damage that they saw on the starboard side was also replicated on the port side. And you're never going to see the exact nature of the iceberg collision on the wreck today, because it buckled right over where it's been speculated to have hit the iceberg. Well, when the bow dug into the bottom and the momentum stopped and the aft end of the bow section settled in, and that buckling basically overwrote the original collision damage. I know there's been talk that Ballard imaged a split seam that he called the iceberg collision damage back in 1986, but it's too high on the hull to come close to the deck plate level in Boiler Room 6. It's at least 2 or 3 strakes higher on the hull. So that's not iceberg collision damage. That's part of the buckling damage.
Well,
so
what I'm hearing, Parks, is that we probably may never know unless they can start, you know, even if you could really photograph underneath the bottom of the ocean where it's dug itself in, because of that buckling, it's sort of destroyed that evidence for you.
Correct.
You feel, yeah.
That's exactly right. We probably never will. So we're going to have 2 competing theories that.
That must be hard for Jim to agree with you when he spent many millions of dollars showing the rivets.
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. It's been the traditional view of the entire Titanic world since 1912. Well, no, I take that back. I'll take that back. The actual first depiction of the iceberg collision that was published in Sphere magazine in April 27th, late April 1912, showed Titanic running over a submerged shelf in the iceberg. And then that soon became the famous 300-foot gash that basically ripped the bottom of Titanic open. And then that has evolved in more recent years into the sideways bump that was shown in the 1997 movie along the side, pushing in plates and whatnot. But so, I mean, it's logical. There are some things that aren't exactly explained by it, like the ice that fell on the forward well deck. There's never really been a good explanation for that. And it's not even explained by the grounding theory either. That's more of an explanation of the shape of the iceberg that was hit. But at any rate, Like I said, I started out thinking of the grounding theory when I looked at the eyewitness testimonies, and then I did this experiment in 2011 where we created 3 samples of that area where Barrett saw the side of the ship let in water, and we did 3 versions of it. Because we discovered during the making, and I'm saying we discovered, it might have been known by others, but I didn't know it until I was designing the samples, that Titanic had a modification done in February of 1912 to that area. In January of 1912, Olympic, during one of the crossings, had gone through a storm that had thrown her about a bit, and it caused a couple of areas of the ship, the ship's hull, to flex, opening. It didn't open up anything, but it loosened some of the rivets. It broke through some of the caulking, and she leaked a bit. So for Titanic, they added a reinforcing bar right there where Barrett saw the water coming in. So we did a sample. We did a sample in the Olympic configuration without the reinforcing bar. And by putting in the reinforcing bar, they add an additional row of rivets. So instead of being triple riveted at that seam, it's called a landing, a strake landing, between the strakes J and K. They added another row of rivets to accommodate this reinforcement bar, and then we did 2 samples in the Titanic configuration. As we were doing the experiment, the first 2 runs, one was against the Olympic and then one was against the Titanic configuration, where we put a horizontal loading as if an iceberg had hit along the side. And in both the Olympic and the Titanic configuration, and by the way, we used rivets. In the Olympic configuration, they were steel rivets. When they needed to put the reinforcing bar in, they had to drill out the steel rivets. And they had originally been put in by a hydraulic press when the hull was being built, but because the hull was already built, they couldn't use a hydraulic press anymore, so they used wrought iron rivets for the Titanic configuration in that area. And addressing the concerns about weak rivets, and we used steel that was 100 years old from an old bridge that had collapsed, so it had the same impurities as the original steel. We found that the steel and the wrought iron rivets behaved similarly. And both the Olympic and the Titanic configuration survived the loading on it without losing any integrity in the seam. A couple of rivets were stressed, but none gave way. We did an ultrasound after the test to check the conditions of the rivets. Then on our last one, we took the Titanic configuration, and instead of hitting it from the side, we did a vertical stress, as if Titanic had ridden up on the iceberg momentarily and come off. In that run, we had a failure of multiple rivets. It's called a racking motion. You have these riveted plates that are together, and when the ship lifts slightly out of the water for a period of time and then back down again, its buoyancy has moved out of the water, and now the weight out of water is pressing down, and these rivets act like guillotines on rivet heads, and it separated a couple of rivets. And then because the boiler room 6, where Barrett saw the wound was 33 feet deep, that's 2 atmospheres of pressure. Once that rivet head was guillotined, then the outside pressure of the water just forced the rest of the rivet in. And as Bill Sauter would comment, indicated that Titanic leaked herself to death through the open rivet holes, high pressure water through the rivet holes. So you don't actually have to have a separation of plates. You don't have to have a tear in the steel or anything like that. You just make enough rivets give way with the pressure of the water behind them. You can sink Titanic that way.
Would that feed into the theory of the rapid flooding of the bulkheads and that the watertight doors were really ineffective because everything filled so fast?
No, I think the watertight doors were effective. It's just that with the water coming in under pressure, it got inside the ship. And I'm not saying that the breach outside of boiler room 6 was the only breach, but it's the only corroborated one we have. And that's why we conducted our experiment around that breach. because we knew how that area was constructed by the plating plans. There could have been other breaches as well. And in fact, another indicator, which to me is the greatest enduring mystery, in my personal opinion, is flooding in boiler room 4 that was noticed after the watertight doors were closed. And while they were drawing the fires, there was water coming up from below in boiler room 4. And I have indications that 2 pump rooms, the one in 4 and the one in 3, were both working to try and stay ahead of that water, and it was gaining on them. So it was a fairly significant breach in boiler room 4. And we the story we've had to date, the narrative we have to date, doesn't account for flooding in boiler room 4. There's always that gash that Barrett saw that extended into boiler room 5's coaling bunker, but never as far aft as 4. In fact, they raised the engineering crew after all the watertight doors closed, and they assessed the situation. They raised the watertight doors, starting in the engine room, working their way forward until they got to boiler room 4, and that's where they stopped. They raised the door into 4, but they knew 5 was flooding, so they let that door down. So the watertight doors were not ineffective in Titanic. They did close, and they did close off the watertight boundaries that they were supposed to, but there was water coming in that overwhelmed that compartmentalization.
You're just making me think how utterly terrifying those, and the fact that Stoker Barrett survived to tell this tale. It's one of my favorite moments in the film. One of the most dramatic and gripping moments is our friend Derek Lee, who plays Stoker Barrett, pushing those boys through that door as it's rattling down, and he gets out just in time. It's a wonderful vignette showing the danger and the absolute get on with it, get out, out. He still survived.
It's a very dramatic scene. What would have been funny is if after he got out, the camera pivoted around and looked at the other stokers left in boiler room 6, including Hendrickson, who stayed in boiler room 6 and kept drawing the fires until the water got up to his knees or his waist. He got pretty high and looked around for supervision, and they'd all bolted. So he and his mates went up the escape ladder up to Scotland Road. So those people left behind in those closed off compartments weren't doomed. There were other survivors that left after Barrett. But Barrett was a good chronicler of events, and his testimony is very valuable, because he tells us not only what happened in boiler room 6, but boiler room 5. Barrett's testimony is a good indication that Titanic never did go full reverse on her engines to avoid the iceberg, because he never saw a full indication, or he never saw what he saw in the boiler room was a boiler room telegraph that originally. And the boilers don't care if the engines are going ahead or astern. They just get a full light, or they get a stop light. And Barrett said the red light came up, which means the stop light on the boiler telegraph, which coincides with Greaser Scott's indication of seeing the telegraphs, all 4 telegraphs, the 2 mains, the 2 emergencies down at the engineer starting platform, the engine room, all go to stop. So basically, when Murdoch never did go full astern to try and avoid the iceberg, he put the engines to stop, and relied on the momentum of the ship to carry him through the avoidance maneuver, which, by the way, is standard operating procedure today for passing by a close object, including a man overboard. If a man goes overboard, one of the first commands is to stop the engines on that side, because you don't want to suck the guy in and chew up the propellers. If you don't have a man overboard, if you're coming close aboard something like an iceberg, you want to stop the propellers to keep them from tearing themselves up if they hit the ice underneath the water. So the more you look at the Titanic story, the Titanic narrative, the more you find these little contradictions that make you ask, is this really what happened? And you start to look at other evidence and see contradictions. So we get our full astern order from Boxall, who basically had come from his quarters. I'm not sure he had his full night vision, and said he saw the engine order telegraphs at full astern. But I don't know. I mean, I've got engine room personnel who never saw a full astern order. It was all, they're all the ones that we have are both saying the same thing, that they received a stop order, which makes sense.
It makes, I mean, just listening to the way you frame the story based on the evidence, you are like this forensic detective that, of course, everybody wants to hear that, new theories or new ways of breaking down the way the story happened. And just listening to the language that you use and the very what's the word? It's like, it's very clear that it could have been this way. We want it to be that way because, legend or telling the story over and over again makes us believe it was such and such a way.
And yet you're an excellent storyteller, which explains why you're a sought-after lecturer. So I mean, you make it very compelling, as scientific and analytical as it is. Which is why, in our few minutes remaining, I want to ask you about the disaster, the Titan implosion. And I mean, you've made so many dives yourselves. I wouldn't imagine you would be at all nervous about submersible exploration, but you would certainly be pragmatic and cautious about it. If you can sort of briefly tell us about what do you think went wrong with the Titan? What were the mistakes from which the submersible community can learn?
So I don't want to get too deep into this, because I did not have first-person knowledge. My experience with OceanGate was they approached me early on to be one of their Titanic experts. And when I saw the design of their submersible, I turned them down because I had concerns about its basic design. I'm used to deep ocean submersibles having spherical pressure hulls and made out of titanium. And the fact that this one was cylindrical with titanium end caps and a carbon fiber fuselage did not sit well with me. So I stayed away from OceanGate. What actually happened to the submersible, I don't know. There's an investigation ongoing right now, and I'm waiting with the rest of you to hear the results of that investigation. But what I will say is that I've heard people say that the Titan disaster is like the Titanic disaster. And I would disagree with that. I fully believe that the Titanic disaster happened because she was well constructed and well managed, well navigated in the context of her time. And it took the Titanic disaster to demonstrate that a lot of assumptions that they had prior to that disaster were faulty. When you look at Titanic in the context of her time, I don't think any bad decisions were made. They were allowed by the conventional thought at the time. By contrast, Titan operated completely independently and in many cases in contradiction to safe practices that the deep submergence community have been following voluntarily for many, many years. Titanic in her time was typical of her period. And in my opinion, Titan in this time was an outlier. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about Stockton Rush's comments about the safety restrictions that he felt inhibited his innovation. And I'll let people who are, when they have the facts of the case, make a judgment on that. But I do have experience with people that I dived with in the deep submergence community who pleaded to Stockton to observed the same safety precautions everyone else was following, and Stockton refused. That's all I know.
What was extraordinary to me actually was that week when nobody knew anything. And, you know, the media and social media just fueled the fire of speculation that became quite unbearable, actually, until it was real experts like yourself and James Cameron, who finally came on and said, look, we know what happened. We know where they are. They're right where they were. And all the while, you know, people were counting down the oxygen and what the conditions would be like in that tiny space for those people. That was what horrified me as much as the fact that all of those safety measures had been ignored, because that was coming up alongside people's hope, I suppose, that they were still going to be rescued.
Well, I knew I got a call first thing Monday morning, and I was told what had happened. The problem there is that the sources were confidential, and I could not share the source, and I could not reference the source in a media interview at that time. And who's going to listen to you if you can't say, you know, name the reason why you believe something that you believe? And even now that we know that the sounds of the implosion and other things were picked up, you still have to remember that this is all remote sensors. Gives you about I'm just going to throw a number out here, 99% chance that you know what happened. But there's that 1% chance that there could have been something else. You know, something else might have imploded out there. I mean, you just don't know. You don't know for sure. Yes, logically you go, the odds are that's them. But there's that 1% chance. And when people's lives are at stake, a search and rescue operation has to go full force with full expectation of trying to rescue somebody until they have concrete proof that a disaster has happened and lives were lost. So I don't fault the Coast Guard or the Navy for proceeding with a rescue operation that they pretty much thought was going to be in vain, because that's not how you want to have rescue services operate. You know, stranger things have happened in life where that 1% actually turned out to be the truth. So, I mean, I can't defend the speculation that went on the media. That was all a self-generating thing, and I tried to dampen it down as much as I could. But again, I couldn't come out definitively and say anything until the source of all this information identified themselves publicly.
Well, it's very obvious why you are sought after, why you're relied upon. You are thoughtful, you are pragmatic, and obviously very judicious. So we're sorry that this could be a 6-hour conversation, best told with models. And I mean, it's fascinating to me. We do need to wrap it up, but you have to promise us to come back again, because we are not finished the conversation, sir.
Wow,
Okay.
I'm just gripped on the edge of my seat.
And where do we find? Where do our audience find you? Where do we direct people to find out more about your continued work?
Well, most of what I do, I save for my public Facebook page, Parks Stephenson, that's with a PH, -explorations. I do have a private page on Facebook, but that's just for family and close friends. So any friend requests there, I usually ignore. But I do have the public page where I post what I feel I can talk about at various times.
Out there, yes.
Commander Stephenson, we're so grateful, and please come back again. You're fascinating. You are the expert at all things Ship of Dreams.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. To celebrate Season 2 of Titanic Talk, we've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop.